So welcome to our study of parenting by parables. I was privileged to be a contributor to this work. Aubrey's such a good friend of mine, and he always encourages me to write and kind of get out of my comfort bubble. And so let's jump into this. In Luke's account of Jesus telling the story, the story is basically in response to these people had gathered around Jesus, and Jesus is eating with people that they find no value in. And so really this is the third story in a series of three, where the first two start with the rhetorical question, what man of you or what woman of you? And he indicts them on their values. What man of you wouldn't forsake 99 sheep and go find one lost one? What woman of you wouldn't forsake 9 silver coins to go look for a single coin? Why do these animals have value? Why do these things have value? But these lost people don't have value. And so that's when he gets into the story of the wasteful or the prodigal son. And so as he begins this story, he basically says this is the value that the father places on lost things. Now, taken at face value, that's what the story teaches. This is the value you place on an animal. This is the value you place on an object. And this is the value you should be placing. The Jews are represented, their value system is reflected in the attitude of the older brother. And of course, God is reflected in the value of the father. That's the face value, I believe, the actual intent that Jesus taught it. But there's some observational things you can do with any narrative. And the narratives are not doctrinal. Narratives are just there for observation, and you can make some extrapolation from the narrative. So here's the high points of this narrative. Number one, mindset matters. This is a look into the mindset of parents, the mindset of God. When children are born and up to a certain age, they really can't distinguish themselves from mom or dad. But as they begin to explore the world, unfortunately, a child's first steps is not typically toward mama, it's away from mama. And they head into the unknown. They head toward cabinets and electrical outlets and the street and the swimming pool that's too deep to swim in. And so those first pictures of children going away from the father is basically that the father allows this child to do some exploring. Tom Caldwell, when he climbed the Dawn Wall and was interviewed about it, he says that it is the job of parents to prepare their children for the path rather than prepare the path for their children. So sometimes children make mistakes. Sometimes children do things, and rather than hovering around them, let them understand that there's a mindset that we have that, hey, we're going to let you become capable. We're going to let you become responsible for the choices that you make. Next observation that probably can be drawn from this story is that you cannot force learning. We want to give children our values. We want to give children our ethic. We want to make children conscientious. But the bottom line is sometimes without experience themselves, they're not going to learn the lesson. When this prodigal son, this wasteful son ends up blowing all his money, ending up in a pig pen, which to a Jewish boy that would have been isolated from friends and family, feeding unclean animals and wishing to eat the food the unclean animals were eating. Oh, wow, what a terrible situation. And so when he comes to himself and he realizes, these are the choices that I've made, and I'd be better off at my father's house. At my father's house, the servants eat plenty and there are leftovers. And so he makes a decision, not a decision his father could force him to learn, but a decision that he learned experientially. And so letting them learn for themselves, and then also, letting them experience their choices. Everything you say yes to is something else you say no to. Everything you say yes to sometimes has a little contingent of friends that it brings with it. So once this young man said, hey, I want to leave you and I don't want your governorship, now with not obeying my rules also comes with not having my protection. With not obeying my rules also comes with, your money is here and it's a finite resource. And so allowing this child to experience the consequences of his choices allowed him to run into himself, as it were, and then make a different or a better choice. Now, once this young man runs into himself and decides that he's going to come home, he comes home, and when he comes home, he asks to be a servant, but the father reinstates or reinstitutes his sonship with a ring and a robe and shoes. And so the father was leaving the past in the past. And so many times when children make mistakes, we like to remind them daily about the mistakes. I run into that oftentimes when I'm dealing with couples and they're trying to reconcile after someone has done something regrettable. And at some point in the marriage therapy, you tell the lady, look, you've got to forgive him or divorce him. But you can't live with him and keep him under this weight of guilt all the time. And so this young man comes home with a heart set that says, hey, I'll be a servant. But dad says, I'm going to give you a ring, I'm going to give you a robe, I'm going to give you shoes. Those are all signs of sonship. And not only signs of sonship, but when the dad gives him that ring, he gives him that ring, making him a true son and having access to the family finances. True justice here is that, hey, you asked for your piece of the inheritance, you got it, you blew it, you ran out. But in truth, the father says, you squandered what I gave you at first, but I'm going to reinstate this value system and allow you to have this again. And so he gives him that signet ring that he can make financial transactions, or essentially be the debit card or the family line of credit. And so when the father brings him back to the house, he leaves the past in the past. He doesn't continue to remind him of it. Now, the older brother, representing the Jewish nation and these Jewish leaders, is unwilling to do that. He comes in with these hypotheticals. Your son has wasted this with riotous living and with harlots. And the text tells us riotous living, but we don't get the specifics. The older brother seems to be maybe even superimposing the things that his little brother was guilty of. And yet the father says, he was lost, he is found, he was dead, he is alive. We're going to reinstate him. And I may be wresting the text a little bit, but I always like to compare Absalom and the prodigal son. Because the prodigal son says, I'm going to leave home. And dad says, well, I can't stop you. I can't superimpose my values on you, so I'll let you go. And he lets him go and lets him face the consequences of his choices. Lets him do some learning on his own. And when the son has the Pigpen moment, he has that epiphany. He comes to himself and he comes home. Absalom is banished, but then he's allowed to come back. He's allowed to be in the city, but not in the palace. He's allowed to have a chariot. He's allowed to have 50 men to run before him. And he's allowed to have access to the people. He's got all the privileges of being a king's son. He just can't be in the presence of the king. And so is he banished or is he not banished? Is he on restriction or is he not on restriction? And because David kind of gives him this mixed signal about who he is, Absalom goes into open rebellion. Now, I do not understand the mind of David, and it may be this is the place where David is a man after God's own heart. Because this is a rebellious, selfish, arrogant, pompous child. And in most cases, David would have dealt with a character like that very swiftly and very violently. I mean, it's nothing for David to kill a man. Saul has slain his thousands. David has slain his 10,000s. And so these people who crossed David were often dealt with in a very violent way. And yet for some reason, David won't drop the hammer on this young man who is obviously not thinking about submitting to his father. And even when Absalom is in open rebellion and David has fled from the citadel at Jerusalem, he tells his army, you deal gently with the young man Absalom. Well, you're at war, David, and you don't deal gently with people in war. But David said, I want you to do that. And so Absalom, not being willing to be banished and not bowing under his father's yoke, is now in this rebellious state. And at some point during the ensuing battle, he runs into Joab. And Joab kills him with either 3 lances or 3 darts in his heart while Absalom is suspended from a tree. In my mind, you have 2 options. We can parent our children like the prodigal's father and say, you know, you got some choices to make, but with those choices come consequences. And if you end up in this Pigpen moment, it's a flip of the coin. There's no guarantees, but you may have this epiphany and come back home. That's iffy. That's a 50-50 chance. But with Absalom, if you ignore the behavior of children and you let them live in open rebellion, and if you let them deny your authority and the authority of God, it is my firm belief that at some point, not if, but when, they're going to have a Joab moment. The Pigpen moment is a flip of a coin. The Joab moment is unrecoverable because they run into the hands of someone who is decisive and does not have their best interest at heart. Now, you may feel punitive, you may feel vindictive as a parent when you do these things, but really you're saving them from a greater tragedy. Had the father said, oh, son, you're down there in the pig pen, let me send you a care package. Oh, son, I know you're down there, I'm going to send some servants to help clean you up. This young man never learns his lesson. When he runs aground in the pig pen and recognizes, here I am sitting around unclean animals willing to eat their food, I'd be better off to be a servant at my dad's house. Now, at first he said, I don't want him to be your son. Now he's willing to be a servant, and he comes home, and then after he comes home, he gets reinstated. Absalom lives in open rebellion and runs into Joab, and his end is decisive. There's no guarantees about the pigpen therapy, but it's a flip of a coin. I do believe there is an absolute guarantee that if you live in open rebellion to your parents and God, then at some point you're going to run into the Joab moment and suffer those consequences. And then, when you start analyzing the story and you start looking at, okay, who am I in this story? Sometimes as parents and as Christians, it's very tempting to be that older brother, to look at other people and say, well, look at what they've done. And look at me, I've always been here and I've never sinned against you. My brother has a sermon called the Parable I Didn't Like. And it's about the workers who get paid a penny. And one of his observations was, how in the world did I make these choices in high school and didn't sleep with my girlfriend and didn't drink and didn't party? And then 15 years later, these guys who live that way come to the church and quote unquote, they're going to get the same reward I am. Gerald ends that sermon with the question, where did you get the audacity to believe that you were an all-day worker? Sometimes we fit in to parenting with our kids like that older brother. Well, I never acted that way. Well, guess what? You probably did. Think about yourself at age 14, at age 17. Think about yourself going through the crisis of a breakup or dealing with peer pressure. It's very easy to judge our children from the standpoint of the older brother. That's an unfortunate place to be. Sometimes we look at this story and we recognize our own lostness. We recognize that there are things that God has given us, some opportunities God has blessed us with, and we've squandered them away. And we may find ourselves looking at this story and realizing, hey, the character in this story is actually the son that was lost, and that's me. And I've taken some opportunities that God has given me as a parent, as a husband, and I'm not using them to the fullest of their potential, and I've been avoiding them or I've been wasteful of them. And it may be that we come to our senses and come back home and do the things at our home that we're supposed to do. And in some cases, we find ourselves being represented by this father, recognizing that people need love and people need mercy and people need grace and people need forgiveness, and being willing to reinstate people into our lives even when they've misused us, when they've misled us, when they've abused us and mistreated us. Now, the son came home, but he came home with conditions. I'm no longer worthy to be your son. I want to be a servant. And with that attitude, he gets to be a son. It's not that there's no change required when the father reinstates, but sometimes we find ourselves in the role of the father and being able to reconcile and help people in their recovery, and even to the point that, hey, he even goes outside to the older brother and says, hey, your attitude's not right either. Just because you're here doesn't mean that we're in agreement. because your value system and my value system are at odds when it comes to your little brother. And I guess the ultimate conclusion of this is, look at the value your father places on lost things. Now, as a parent, it's very easy to get frustrated. It's very easy to get mad. It's very easy to write people off. It's very easy to say this is unfixable, unrecoverable. But what does your father do with you? What does my father do with me? The value system of God toward lost things is the father sitting on the hill, and he's looking off into the distance looking for the son. And when that son starts home, the first time the father sees him, he rises and runs to meet him. Your father is waiting to run to meet you. Your father is looking for an opportunity to reconcile. Now, if my father's willing to reconcile with me, then as a father, I should be looking for opportunities to reconcile with my errant children. Let them learn from mistakes. Let them travel their own path. Let them make their own choices. I'm not going to capitulate and parent them like an Absalom, but I'm going to let Pigpen therapy see if it has its work. And then if it does, and you get a penitent heart, you get a returning son, then I'm going to try to emulate my father and be that father who loves, meets them more than halfway, reinstates, and forgives. Parenting by parables. An awesome opportunity to be involved in this project with Aubrey. I hope that reading the book gives you some insights, and I hope that reading this book allows you to look at your story and these stories and fit yourself somewhere and recognize I'm either the person who needs to be forgiving, or I may be one of those people who needs to be forgiven. And this story teaches that your father is willing to do just that. God bless you, and God bless the reading of his word.